Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. And there have been an awful lot of events in my guest this week. Samantha Power is the former US ambassador to the United Nations. She's been a journalist, a foreign policy advisor to Barack Obama. And let me begin by quoting what he says about her. Samantha Power is a Pulitzer winner, an incredible writer, and a great friend. Her memoir grapples with the balance between idealism, pragmatism, advocacy, and governancy. It's a must-read for anyone who cares about our role in a changing world. It's called The Education of an Idealist. Is this your document of realizing how dreadful trying to change the world is?
No, pray not. No, idealists are people who think the world isn't as it ought to be. And I suppose an activated idealist is somebody who then has the gall to think that maybe there's something at least small that they can do to try to make things better. And if you're trying to make things better, especially now when things aren't going that great, last I checked, I think we all have a responsibility to learn as we go. And so I learned, I think, how to be more effective at harnessing the tools, limited though some of them are, imperfect though all of them are, but how to get better at sort of prosecuting my ideals over time in a bunch of different venues and incarnations, just landing at the point where I thought, okay, I get it. Now I know how to optimize. Doesn't mean now I know how to fix X or Y, but learning along the way about the power brokers, what they respond to, incentives, disincentives, to try to be more effective as an idealist in this world.
I mean, how did you become an idealist?
There have been moments in my life when I was focused on myself and a very different potential career path where I was arrested, my attention was arrested with images of great injustice. And so the best example of this, I come to America as an immigrant when I'm 9, so I was just a kid, lived in Pittsburgh in 1979, arrived at the time where the Pittsburgh baseball team, known as the Pirates, were soaring into playoff glory and would end up winning the World Series, the last time they would win the World Series. Why does that matter, you might ask, for my idealism? Well, I decided that the way to fit in as a new immigrant to America was to learn everything there was to know about baseball. I carried this obsession forward with me all the way through university. I got to go to Yale University, an amazingly rich academic environment, very politically progressive, on campus, all kinds of causes I could have attached myself to. I had no interest. Sport. I was the play-by-play voice for the Yale men's basketball team. I did color commentary for the Yale baseball team. I was on a half-hour sports nightly talk show. This was my life. And yet one of my summers during university, as I was interning at the CBS network affiliate in Atlanta, Georgia, and as I was taking notes faithfully on an Atlanta Braves baseball game so as to cut the highlights for the sports section of the evening news, the footage from Tiananmen Square beamed in on the CBS feed that I only accidentally saw. Like if it was, me at home watching TV, I would have been watching ESPN or Sky Sport or, and yet because I was in this crazily serendipitous little glass booth where there were all of these screens, the images of students being basically steamrolled by their government, mowed over, got my attention, mercifully got my attention. And I just sort of stopped and I thought, my God, what is happening? Here are these 18, 19-year-olds. All they want to do is be able to speak their mind and gather and liberalize just at the margins. And this is what they're being met with. And so that did not make me say to myself, I'm going to change the world. And I have so many skills that are going to make that easy. And I'm so qualified. No, I thought, I need to pay a little more attention in school. I don't really know, how do those students even get there? Wait, what's happening in China again? And now, what does the United States, my adopted country, what does a country like ours do in the face of something like that? And so it was like I was hooked a little bit on current affairs, but I was so ignorant. And so when I went back to campus, I subscribed to the New York Times, which I'd never subscribed to before, nor had my parents. We were an apolitical family. and I began underlining, like in the newspaper, the facts and the figures and the rough populations and who the head of state was and what the history was. And I just gradually became a more sentient, aware citizen, such that out of college, my first job was I wasn't able to get work in sports journalism initially, was as an intern. I could never find paid work, but at a foreign policy think tank. And there, the guy I happened to work for was somebody who had been a career US diplomat. And so for the first time, I was actually working with somebody who'd been in the US government at a very senior level. He'd been ambassador in Turkey when the United States decided to set up a safe haven for the Kurds in northern Iraq just after the first Persian Gulf War in 91. And he'd been instrumental in that. And suddenly I was with this person who didn't just know things about the world, but very quickly thought to himself, what should the United States do about it? And this was a unipolar moment. The wall had by then fallen, the Soviet Union had collapsed. And so I was just his intern, like his lackey, pouring coffee and occasionally editing articles, op-eds he had written and so forth for the newspaper. But to be around somebody who was so constructive and so determined to be useful. Now, when I was privy to what was happening in the Balkans, which was the big conflict of the moment, which you know well, I was with somebody who didn't just say, oh, how horrible, they're setting up rape camps, they're targeting Muslims on the basis of their religion or their ethnicity. Instead, he said, here's what NATO should be doing. Here's the cost to NATO being on the sidelines. Here's the cost to any potential for a new world order at this moment of transition after the Cold War. And it was sort of exhilarating, I suppose, on one level to just be with somebody whose idealism was so practical and was so prescriptive and was rooted in the same thing that had moved me in the Tiananmen moment of this is wrong, this is bad, but didn't pivot then to someone should do something, but pivoted very specifically to here's what that something should look like, and here's how the constraints can be overcome to get there.
And so, I totally get that. I mean, that Bosnia or the former Yugoslavia in general would be the moment at which you become, pro-intervention, because that was a conflict in which, again, terrible things happened for a long period of time, and you would wonder how the world could sit by and not really be doing very much. So that. You then went there as a journalist, effectively, didn't you? I mean,
I did, and I mean, if I maybe just to pause, just because of the nature of this program, which is just for an idealist, it's so cool that such a program exists, but about changing the world in small or big ways. But I just to stress, I think the hardest moment for anyone who doesn't like what they see around them, who feels as if there's some injustice that should be remedied, but the first thought they have is, but I'm so small. I'm one person. Like, what can one person do? It's just, I hear it so very often. We all do, and we all feel it. President Obama felt it at times, even when he was the most powerful person in the universe, arguably. For me, working in my 20s and getting exposure, as you say, to what was happening in Bosnia, it wasn't just that. Suddenly I had all these people who the person I was working for was encountering, who were showing that there were all of these pathways, working at an NGO, helping refugees or delivering humanitarian assistance, writing editorials to try to pressure somebody, being a physician and excavating mass graves to document crimes. There was the new court at The Hague. You could be a lawyer and potentially hunt down, the perpetrators of these crimes. I think where people get hung up is, there's a saying, I think which is, can implies ought. And if you can't see the can, if there's no pathway, it's, often people sort of stymie themselves and don't get to the what I ought to do because I know I can't. So why would I make myself just feel bad that I'm not doing the thing that I know I can't do? And so for me, and what I hope I do in the book is open up the universe of ways, even in such tiny ways, that you can, and then that allows, I think, people to develop what your question came to, which was what ought one do. And for Bosnia, I would not have characterized myself as pro-intervention as a general proposition. My instincts were, I was quite small-minded in a way. I was just living within the universe of what was happening in this one country of 4+ million, where half the people had been displaced, where the perpetrators weren't backed really in a significant way by any major power. By the standards of certainly today's conflicts, a pretty straightforward picture. I mean, it didn't feel straightforward to policymakers, I grant, but when I couldn't get to work at an NGO or a think tank or anything because I had no qualifications to do so, I ended up going over there as a war correspondent, believing, as a freelancer, believing that if we could somehow tell the story in a vivid way, if we could bridge the distance between what was happening on the ground and the decision-making circles where people were hanging back, that that could be influential. I did not go over believing it would be. I was just a kid, I was in my early 20s, but I thought, I will learn. I'll learn the language, I'll learn the history, I'll learn even how the UN works and doesn't work on the ground. I'll learn about where US ideals meet the reality of post-Cold War ethnic conflict. And I developed this kind of framework for every decision point in my life, which was, if all I get out of this is X, and in that case it was learning the language and learning the history, will it have been worth it? And I think for people who feel paralyzed by the prospect of making an impact, I think that test that in one's own mind is like, if all I get out of this is, and whatever X is for any given person, any given crossroads, it's kind of freeing because it's like, okay, the baseline is I would learn something, I would grow. I'm 21, 22 years old. That's okay. That's a lot, actually. And instead of saying, am I going to be the one to save the Bosnians? If you set that up as your standard, you're going to fail by definition, and you won't go because you know you're going to fail.
I mean, why have you told the story of your home life and parents split? I mean, basically, your mother took you to America because your parents broke up. I mean, obviously that's a formative story, and these things are formative in anyone's lives. But how do you think it has made you the sort of the person you are in terms of what you do and how you think?
Well, I never thought that being an immigrant would be so noteworthy as it has become in our current politics. And so, again, there are a lot of different ways to write in the current moment. You can go right at the move away from, I think, what makes America a very special place with its diversity and its, for all of its flaws, its inclusivity. As the current president moves away from that, I could have written something saying that's terrible. Immigration is great. Look at all the economic returns. Instead, I just tell you my story, my simple story of getting to come to this country with many more advantages than a lot of immigrants have, namely speaking English and coming, from a tradition that, has a lot in common with the American tradition. In telling my story, to just show, not tell, what America has offered, and then how one person who happens to be an immigrant has taken advantage of what America has offered to try to give back in some, again, small ways.
Because you only became an American citizen in your 20s.
Yeah, just before I went to, or just as I was going back and forth to Bosnia for the first time in '93.
So was your identity Irish or
I think,
American? Or?
as is true, I think of many whose parents sort of take them as a kid. To this day, I don't think my mother really even knows. But when I got on the plane to come to America, I did not think it was forever. I thought I was going to go have the best of all worlds, stay Irish. Who doesn't want to be Irish? And I'd learn about American sports, and my mother would get to run away with the man she loved, who was now my stepfather all these years later, a Dublin doctor like her. There was no divorce in Ireland back then. It came about really relatively recently. And so for her to be with the person she loved and to pursue advances in medicine, she was going. So I like internalized all of that as a kid, just thinking, oh, it's a good opportunity for mom and a great wonderland for any kid to move to this large, kind of bounty, cornucopia, even just going to the grocery store, turning on the television. We had the 3 channels in Ireland. One of them was in Irish. And suddenly you have all of these channels and all of this opportunity. And so as a kid, you just kind of skating by. But my father, one of the reasons my mother left him was that he was an alcoholic, and it was becoming more and more of his vocation was to be a pub goer. more and more of my life was spent with my dad in the pub before we left to move to America. And I think my mother was very worried about pub life and kids and for all the obvious reasons, but she was also busy with her career and, not as much of a counterweight as she wanted to be to those exposures. And when I got to America, not long after, a few years later, my father died, what to me was very, very sudden, basically at age 47, having drank himself to death, and particularly accelerated what was already happening before we left, accelerating that after we left. And so, why do I write about all of that? It is a little, maybe to some kind of TMI, as they say. I think that, when you become a cabinet member of the President of the United States or UN ambassador, there's some idea that your road is linear, rather than human and vulnerable. And I lived in my youth and really up until, I'm sure I'll look back even now when I'm 49 years old at still feeling some version of this, but I lived with, for a long time, with a sense of responsibility that I stayed in Ireland as a child, not that I could have stayed without my mother, but kids exaggerate their agency in these moments. But that had I stayed, I would have been reason enough for my dad to give up the drink or to lighten up on the drink. And I felt guilty. I felt immensely responsible. And therapists through the years, when I write in the book about how much I hated therapy when it was forced upon me by my friends who thought I was making poor romantic choices and thought that they may be rooted in my childhood, which was like psychobabble 101, as far as I could tell. But once I overcame that resistance and really delved into it, I really, from a personal standpoint, I was afraid of being close to people, no question. And so to go to war zones and to be flitting from one dangerous place to another where you never got too close, you may have gotten close to the story, but you didn't allow yourself really to establish roots. That probably was not unrelated to this fear that if I again allowed myself to love in the way that I had loved my dad, that would also vanish as he had, very abruptly. But also a sense that, probably, maybe somewhere, at least this is what the shrinks will tell you, that if you have the chance when you're older and you do have agency to try to look out for somebody who isn't in control of their destiny, use that chance. And so in a way, to harness that regret and that pain in as constructive a way as I could. Now, again, my story isn't about that epiphany driving me to Bosnia. It was about Bosnia driving me to Bosnia. And I resist the therapeutic accounts that root everything in childhood because I want to live in a world where the fact that people were being targeted with genocide in Bosnia is intrinsic reason enough, even if you've had a comfortable childhood where both your parents are thriving. And so it's complicated why any of us end up doing what we do. But I do definitely feel at least the privilege of having had the chance given to me by Barack Obama to be in a position, again, to look out for people who don't really have voices on the international stage.
I mean, the book is very personal in all sorts of ways. It's about your own childhood in Ireland and your parents, but it also takes in some of those huge foreign policy moments, failures, as some people see them, in Libya and Syria, and your role in that. I mean, given how close you are to Obama, how easy is it to be sort of warts and all honest about what happened and how, to appraise what happened and what went wrong?
Well, again, we're sort of living in a moment in history where black and white is pretty much in fashion, and the gray areas, the idea that there are actual moral dilemmas where there are reasonable arguments on both sides. I don't know when that went out of fashion, but that's not exactly how contemporary discourse, at least in the States, is going. And so I decided to break with the moment and bring readers into those debates, offer the context in which Obama made a decision that you might disagree with on Libya to respond to the Libyan ambassador to the UN's plea that the world do something to protect civilians, respond to the Arab League plea, with the backing of the UN Security Council even behind him. But you still may think it's a bad idea because of how Libya looks today, and that's reasonable. But I want you to know why somebody as eminently reasonable as Obama felt that all things considered he had to move. I was on the other side of the Syria issue, thinking that we should take a little more risk in order to establish, for example, a no-fly zone to mitigate the harms against Syrians who were being murdered in ever more creative and brutal ways by Bashar al-Assad. Obama took a different view, and his view is reasonable. I think that, in my case, I wasn't full of dogmatism, that if we did what I was recommending, that Syria would suddenly become a peaceful place. I was of the view that we should sort of tip toward incurring more risk to mitigate the harms. But once Syria was as broken and as divided from a sectarian standpoint as it was, nobody, idealist or not, you'd have to be utopian to believe that the United States could snap its fingers and put Syria back together again. That wasn't the aspiration. So sometimes you're just in a world of lesser evils where you're doing the best you can on the basis of imperfect information. And Syria shows when the United States stays removed from something, there can be terrible harms like the killing of maybe 500,000 people, the flight of millions, tens of millions more, including a massive migration in Europe that has changed Europe, maybe even changed the United Kingdom for forever. Just the salience of immigration and migration stemming in large measure from the Syrian war. But it doesn't mean that I sit here today and can tell you if we'd only done what Samantha recommended, that Syria would be at peace, Brexit wouldn't have happened, Trump wouldn't have been elected. I can't say that. And so that's life in the big city, at those policy tables where the stakes are that high, when life and death issues are being presented to people with a lot of power. You if you're lucky, you have people who are really hearing arguments on all sides, willing to grow and learn, willing to hear contrary perspectives. If you're unlucky, you get, policy by tweet and a much more fickle approach.
You talked in the book about how you wanted to go much further. Obama had drawn the line in the sand. Assad then used chemical weapons, killed a huge number of people, and the images were terrible. And Obama blinked. Now, you say he just took a different view. Why? Somebody else must have persuaded him. Was it Susan Rice? I mean, was it
No,
him? What happened?
We're people, that sort of inside debate of who's where, and when I was a reporter, I was very interested in that also. But actually, especially in the case of President Obama, I mean, I think he had his own view, and it just took time. The variables kind of changed. So to rewind, he had issued his red line threat in 2012. There were a series of very small attacks throughout 2013. There were a lot of questions about intelligence in light of the Iraq War and the flawed intelligence that gave rise to that. So an effort to be super careful that you're not getting it wrong as to who's using is it chemical weapons. And so that kind of becomes a protracted process. I think that's a real missed opportunity, actually, to send a signal prior to the very big attack that occurred
So
in
was there real doubt
August. And
about those reports?
I don't think there was doubt, but I think there was a recognition that even though there'd been a change in administrations, you needed to present something pretty airtight to the international community to build the kind of support that you'd want before you would do anything aggressive in response. And so, again, in retrospect, I think it was probably a mistake, but there was a desire to see not U.S. intelligence, but to have UN inspectors in there being the ones to present that evidence. And so you saw, again, what could have been an immediate response, maybe, again, something limited, but nonetheless a slap on the wrist that might deter. You saw instead a desire to bring the international community in. Again, the thing that many people around the world love about Obama, a committed multilateralist, a believer that legitimacy matters in statecraft as it does in one's own life. But then the clock sort of ticks. Assad takes a signal that even if he doesn't have a green light, he's kind of able to get away with it. And then he does a really big, stages a really large attack where 1,400 people are killed. And it's not just the images, it's just the actual loss of life of civilians who are, parents who are trying to shield their children from a gas from which they can't be shielded. I mean, it was horrific. I was new in my job. Obama decided to use force immediately, no hesitancy. David Cameron said, "Could you just wait? We'd like to join you. I want to go to my parliament." As the clock ticked, Obama asked me to get the UN weapons inspectors out so that they wouldn't be taken as human shields. Again, something we value in President Obama, that he would care about civilian casualties, care about the international representatives who were there trying to do good work on behalf of the rest of us. And yet, as the clock ticked from a week to 10 days, opposition began to grow, and the specter of the deaths of those kids began to fade, and the memories of Iraq and how, something can go wrong in the Middle East, particularly in a complicated environment like Syria, that becomes much more salient. And Obama begins to believe that if he acts militarily, the likelihood is Assad will test him and maybe use again, gas again. And none of the military targets could, by definition, be chemical weapons facilities because then you'd harm civilians. So he decides to go to Congress. And that's the fateful decision. It's not, he doesn't decide, I'm not going to use force. He decides, I'm going to get the Republicans who've been calling on me to use force from the very beginning, Democrats who understand that chemical weapons pose a very significant threat to the international order, generally, including to American troops. We can pull this coalition together. Well, it turns out Republicans who were for military force on a Friday, as soon as Obama was for it, came to oppose it. Democrats heard from their constituencies, we don't want any more war in the Middle East. And we didn't have the votes
And they
in
had
the Congress.
seen the vote in Britain
And they'd seen the vote in
against
Britain.
military action as
Yeah.
well. I mean, do you understand in retrospect how he came to that decision? I mean, and do you feel, did he lack moral certainty about the rights and wrongs of his actions, given what had happened?
No, I think he was absolutely, there's revisionism out there now, which is really and truly false, that he went to Congress in order to fail. No, you do not, if you're the commander in chief, want to show the world that you can't mobilize domestic democratic support for something you believe is in your national security interest. That's not your goal. Why did he go to Congress? I think the passage of time, I mean, honestly, there were people in the Pentagon who leaked the targets that he was planning on hitting. So there really was an ability of Assad to kind of move things around. And with the, again, that I know it sounds quaint that a ticking clock could matter so much, a matter of days or hours even could matter, but it really did. And he wanted to be engaged in Syria in a way that showed, if not American unity, which already was probably not in the cards, just that there was support for what the president was doing, that he wasn't out on his own, and that would show Assad that he was in it for the longer term. We under the Constitution, and this gets back to who he is as a leader and as a thinker and as a lawyer, he had taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago. His belief was, under the war powers, that he could only act under his commander-in-chief authority for 60 days. So that clock, which is not something people around the world really think that much about, a different clock, was one that was very much on his mind. He thought, okay, I staged these strikes. Say Assad tries to prolong this, uses again, then I'm using more air power. Then say we run out of targets in areas that are not populated by civilians. I want the license to be able to do what is needed in order to get this genie back in the bottle. What he didn't do, what we should have done, is he should have known literally on a piece. We should have, it sounds crazy that we didn't, but one should have been able to articulate exactly who was going to support the congressional authorization measure before you went to Congress, before you became publicly saddled with this need for an authorization, because there are other constitutional interpretations that many other presidents have taken, which is that you didn't need Congress, that this wasn't an act of war, that you could go for as long as you wanted. And
Yeah.
I mean, certainly that would be the approach that Trump would take. He wouldn't care about the rule of
And
law
if
and
he'd
the
done what Trump
Constitution.
did in the end, which was a surgical, perhaps meaningless strike that didn't really damage anything, but made a point,
Right.
maybe back then it would have made a difference.
I mean, I think this is probably President Obama today would argue the very thing you, Samantha, wanted me to do didn't make a difference when Trump did it. So why would it have made a difference earlier? I would argue, that things that happened earlier may make a different difference than things that happen later. And this is all hindsight is 2020, and we just don't know.
So how did you manage to stay? I mean, given how strongly you'd felt about this, I mean, John McCain told you to resign, didn't he? I mean, and there was so much anger and bitterness about that at the time.
Yeah, and a lot of it toward me personally because of my past work on atrocity prevention. I think on one level, understandably, in a book that I'd written about Bosnia and about where I touched on what happened in Cambodia and the secret bombing by the Nixon administration of Cambodia, I had kind of valorized people who resigned. Not kind of. I had spoken, with great admiration, and I do have great admiration for people who are willing to give up the careers that they had coveted for such a long time for the sake of principle or because of a desire to make a different kind of difference. You try within the system, you beat your head against the wall enough times, you decide that the path to making change is foreclosed, you leave and hope that the act of your resignation will gin up some new debate. For me, I debated every time I heard a call for my resignation. I made a point of stepping back and really looking at am I just a hypocrite? Am I somebody who said that this was great when they did it, but now I'm, in the fancy UN ambassadorship and am I somehow attached to being in power more than what I'm doing? But I would actually make lists of the issues I was working on and assess whether or not someone similarly situated would bring the same conviction to that set of issues. And they range from promoting LGBT rights in the UN and making the UN for the first time consider LGBT rights as human rights, getting the Security Council to condemn killing on the basis of sexual orientation for the first time in 7+ decades, getting officers who cared about human rights and sexual violence and child soldier recruitment integrated into UN peacekeeping missions, getting peacekeepers repatriated when they themselves preyed on civilians who were counting on them. And there was just so much that I was working on that I felt had impact, that had meaning, that where when I went back to being a professor or an activist or somebody who screamed at the TV from afar rather than, making my case to the president, I didn't feel like I'd have those impacts. And even on Syria, as small as it felt, believe me, to me and above all to the Syrians, to be even able to get one political prisoner out of jail working with the Russian ambassador, or to get humanitarian assistance to one enclave in the northern part of the country that had been cut off for months. I mean, that was not nothing. And so I, made the am I like a mascot, a kind of humanitarian? Everyone can say, well, Samantha's in the administration, therefore, we're having a robust debate on Syria. Like that was a real possibility. I had seen that happen in history, but I never felt that way, and I never felt as though, for as strongly as I felt that we should incur more risk, it wasn't as if President Obama's position was unprincipled, unreasonable. I mean, he was looking again at a domestic landscape that, yes, as Senator McCain reminded me, he had a role in helping shape, but a landscape where people did not want war. And it is when you are the president elected to get America out of wars and to draw down your presence, it is no small thing to contemplate an entanglement of that nature. And so if again, I felt from where I sit, we should do X or Y, but if I'm Obama and I'm seeing a very different landscape, I get it.
And do you think he gets it? Because, I mean, when asked about his regrets,
yeah,
he's talked about Libya. He hasn't talked about Syria. And really, in terms of lives lost, Syria is so much worse.
I think, I mean, the case I've just made to you is a version. I mean, this is why I try to be very fair to his perspective in the book, because I want people to understand why somebody who's deeply humane, eminently reasonable, understands the strategic costs of losing also credibility when you make a threat and then don't follow through. I mean, he's Barack Obama, right? He's not interested in personal enrichment or financial enrichment, the kinds of things we're now becoming used to. But I think he basically believes that Syria today would likely not look that different if he had carried out limited military strikes. I would like to have tested that proposition to see if we could have energized our diplomacy and so forth before Russia got involved in 2015. And he would say, well, here are the reasons we didn't.
The thing that is quite striking, I think, to think about now is reading this sort of account of foreign policy as it has been done for decades is so different to how foreign policy is done right now in the United States.
Do you think?
And
I'll say.
And things have changed so much. Is it recoverable in your eyes?
I hear two questions more than any others. One I've already mentioned, which is, but what can one person do? And the second is, are we going to be okay? The second is so poignant because it's like, who's the we? What's okay? And yet it speaks, I think, to the crisis of confidence that, for very good reason, many of us are feeling at the moment. I mean, I guess the question is, what are we seeking to recover? It's extremely rare that or it's very common, let me put it in this positive form, that the way a government treats its citizens is actually a pretty good predictor of the kind of partner it's going to be and the extent to which it's going to actually help advance your interests if you're the United States or the United Kingdom for that matter. And so at a policy level, that's true. But also, at a practical level, when you treat people with respect, I did this, tried to do this at the UN. I hope I am remembered for having done it. I went and I visited each of the 191 other ambassadors at their missions. And I would go and I would not bring my list of asks, of which I always had a dozen things I wanted from people, but I would just ask them where they came from, what were the books or the art, on their walls or on their shelves, and try to dig into what made them go into careers in public service, which, many of these are the bright lights in their societies and they're not earning a ton of money and they believed in doing something for their country. And they come from countries where they have politics and they have bureaucracies and infight and all the same muck that all of us deal with in our own lives. They carry all of that. And when it came time to call them to stand up to Russia on its invasion of Ukraine, many of them had instructions from Capitol to duck that fight. And many of them, I believe, because of that investment in the relationship, because of the respect and listening that we at the U.S. mission, I think, were able to project and to show and to enact. Didn't make them able to change the world, but it made them advocates for doing the right thing when it came to a blatant act of aggression. When it came to LGBT rights, many of the people that I visited with were individuals who came from countries that actually criminalized LGBT status. They were not going to be able to get permission from their government to vote with me on LGBT rights, but they might happen to have a dentist appointment at just the time the vote is happening. So they may be in a position not to vote with Russia, which their instructions might have had them do. And so I just think the way in which our values and how we treat people and the extent to which we value individual dignity and national dignity, sort of has really practical returns. Back to the current moment,
Are we going to be okay?
are we going to be okay
Yes.
when there isn't that respect for dignity and, if anything, just, again, a kind of crass debasement of our institutions? What is being pursued cannot work. There's no way you can um, respect the needs and the welfare of, even in Donald Trump's case, of the people who swept you into office. That sector of the American voting public that had voted for Barack Obama in 2012 and shifted to Donald Trump, so capable of voting for a progressive African American president. And then, 9% of the people who voted for Obama in 2012 voted for Trump in 2016. 7% of those who voted for Obama stayed home in 2016. And that was an election settled by 78,000 votes. Those individuals are swing voters or people who could come out, didn't come out, may come out again to vote. That's millions and millions of votes. And so are Donald Trump's policies delivering for them? It's he who cares only about Donald Trump. Are his policies speaking to those individuals who feel left behind by globalization? They are not. They're raging against minorities and against immigration. I get that. But at the end of the day, if your healthcare premiums are going up, if the future of work remains as bleak from the standpoint of your skill set as it was before Donald Trump if none of the factories that have given way to automation or that have been outsourced, where the making of particular goods have been outsourced to other countries, are coming back in the way that he promised. I mean, that, more than any slogan about an immigrant, how you're able to provide for your family and whether you feel that your dignity is in fact being respected, that's going to have a profound effect. So that's on the question of whether we can make a turn from this way of being internationally. When we look to build a coalition, when the United States faces its next threat, why would the United Kingdom even, but certainly Germany, Canada, the countries that are first to spring to our side, why would that be deemed a good idea given the disrespect and even the contempt that has been shown for some of our closest allies?
He would say, that under Obama, take Syria, Assad was allowed to win, ISIS flourished, took over half of Iraq and Syria. Under Trump, I've crushed ISIS and killed the leader.
he will say all kinds of things. He's also saying that he's bringing troops home and he's sending more troops to more places than, certainly than what he inherited. Um, he will be the master of diversion and deceit for the rest of time. I think the question is whether people who find that dispiriting, debasing, detrimental, destructive, whatever it is, are they willing to activate? Activate in small ways, just registering and voting and turning out, or in bigger ways. And we're seeing, more young people, more untraditional candidates running for office than ever have in the United States. The midterm elections, the greatest turnout since Watergate. And so this is both a moment, I think, of significant darkness, no question, but it's also a moment where you're reminded that you get the democracy you work for. And I think the hardest part of our recovery, back to your question, is going to be credibility. And because once Donald Trump and Trumpism have happened once, there is a risk, of course, that it can happen again. And so when we go to our allies and say, hey, we're back, ready to believe in international cooperation again, ready to promote human rights again, ready to recognize that we have much more in common with democracies than we do with dictators again, ready even to figure out how to stand up to China, but also to cooperate with China again, to find some complex modus vivendi with a government that is this abusive and now this aggressive beyond its borders. The question we are going to get in the United Kingdom, all across Europe, and really all around the world is going to be, yeah, but how do we know that this commitment you're making is an enduring commitment? And so the challenge really, I think, is going to be more than the intrinsic harms that Trump has caused, which are ample, and even more than the polarization that abets those harms. The question is going to be, how can we rebuild trust, sort of one day at a time, one step at a time. And we went through a version of this after George W. Bush's presidency. And I can tell you that so many of the things Obama wanted to do in the first term were hard to do because it took so long to get back on track after Guantanamo, after torture. And now it's a hole that will be so much bigger. But, this is where it's important both to win in 2020 for Democrats, but also the margin of victory, the ability, which I know is, I'm not in any way being complacent about the prospect of winning. It's going to be really hard given Trump's structural advantages and the fact that Fox News is, in effect, state TV for him, and not covering so much of what has ailed this presidency. So it'll be really hard to win. But to the degree that there can be a substantial margin that will allow public servants, the next president, American citizens who travel abroad, business people, to say the fever has broken. We went to that dark place, but look at the margin. Look at how we not only rejected a president or a political figure, but we rejected the ideology, the racism, the self-enrichment, the corruption that were embodied in that leadership. And that's going to be really important to that question of, are we going to be okay? Because trust will be the foundation for getting back on track at some point. And the world is going to look not 4 years different from the world that, on January 20th, 2017, Barack Obama, when he walked out of the White House, the world that we all left on that day, history is moving in a hurry. And so we also will have to adjust our expectations for what other countries expect of us.
We give our guests the chance to sort of say, well, if you could just change the world, what would you do? I mean, it's a big, long list, I guess. But if you could wave a magic wand, what would it be?
If I could wave a magic wand, the structural impediment to everything I care about right now is political polarization / real questions about the role of facts and science and truth. And so my magic wand would have us develop far more of a consensus, not only in the States, but all around the world, hallowing and respecting, revering the status of science, which corrects itself mercifully, remembering that facts are the foundation for any sensible political discourse and disagreement, and recovering an ability that we have lost to change our minds. People are each of us are getting more and more dug in, but to change our minds, to do so on the basis of facts. So my magic wand, and it would really have to be quite potent, would be to get back to having, a consensus around some baseline set of American values. And from that baseline and from a factual set of predicates, to have civic, reasonable debate and the possibility of bipartisanship, which has been really lost in recent years in the States. And maybe if we don't do it on our own, the fact that we see foreign actors now, Russia, but soon I'm sure to be China, again, exploiting our divisions, seeking to widen them. Maybe if we can't see it ourselves, we can look and say, well, geez, if Putin thinks this is in his interest, maybe it's in our interest to do the opposite and to come together.
Samantha Power, thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry we have to leave it there. There's so much more I could ask you, but we're out of time. So thank you very much indeed for joining us.
I'm really
and
grateful.
Sharing your ways to change the world. Hope you enjoyed that. If you did, then please do give us a rating and a review. Our producer is Rachel Evans. And you can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Until next time, bye-bye.